Sanrio Timenet, Mirai. This is gonna completely shock you, a monster catching RPG on the Game Boy Color that came out in two separate individual versions that are basically the same game that happened to come out sometime after Pokemon got famous. Coincidence? I think not. I don't think I need to say this, but after Pokemon, literally everyone and their grandma's dog tried to make their own multi-versioned RPG monster taming games on the Game Boy, which is probably why in all my time collecting weird Japanese games, I've gotten like a dozen of them or so. This one's a little bit interesting because it's Sanrio branded, so yes, there is Hello Kitty and friends to be found. Now the story follows the old man of time noticing there's a problem with the pillar of time and sends out for two kids to go and fix things. He sends one to the past, which was Sanrio Timenet Kakuhen, and one to the future, which is this version, Sanrio Timenet Mirai. And they have to go save the pillar of time by collecting 161 Sanriomon and delivering them to their PC to fix the time stability, I guess. Now, at its core, the sort of overarching goal is to save the Pillar of Time, and to do this, as I said, you have to catch 161 Sanriomon. Now, you might think this sort of goes back to the sort of Pokemon gotta catch 'em all spirit where, oh hey, there's X number of monsters, we need every single one in our Pokedex, and then we beat the game. And that is where you are wrong, my friend. For you see, while there are 161 different Sanriomon out there, you only need to put 161 in the computer. They don't necessarily have to be different. In fact, you could theoretically complete the larger overarching goal of this game in the level 1 area, just catching the exact same monster over and over and over, if you wanted. I don't know why you'd want to, but you could do it. There's even a progression tracker that keeps track of your total percentage of monsters you've put into the computer to restore the time cylinder or whatever the plot was on about. But it just comes across as a little strange that your overarching goal could be theoretically completed in the first area simply by virtue of the fact that I guess they wanted you to be able to actually complete the game 100% without having to actually trade other people. I mean, you can do that, sure, but it's not required, which in its own way I think makes it a little bit more advanced than Pokemon just by the fact that you don't need someone else and their copy of a different game and a link cable and all this extra nonsense in order to see the ending or see the true ending or whatever. But that said, you still have to buy a second copy and trade between them in both if you want to complete both of them, so you know. You can complete the overall objective, but to truly say you've beaten both, yeah, you still need all of them to fill out your Sanrio Dex, or whatever it is. At least they tried to make it a little bit more accessible for those of us who don't have friends, or friends who import, or the metric crap ton of extra stuff you need to actually trade monsters between these games. It's nice. Now what I really like about this game is the incredibly straightforward progression system. When it comes to importing, this can be a real challenge if you can't read the language, which I can't. You know, you start in a giant open world and you can go 8 different ways from the start. You are completely screwed in terms of trying to figure out where you need to go. Whereas in this one, you start in a small town, you're completely stuck here until you go through one small dungeon in there, and then one path out of that town opens up, and then you follow that way until you get to a dead end, and then the other path opens up, and it just slowly opens the world up, and it's a lot more accessible if you can't read it. That actually makes this game really approachable by pretty much anyone, which is great. But I mean, it's not a monster catching RPG, unless we catch some monsters. And in Sanriomon, it's actually pretty damn solid. The game seems to follow a rock, paper, scissors sort of weakness style, with 3 different types of attack and defense. So, Type A is going to be powerful against Type B, but weak to Type C, and Type B is going to be good against Type C, but weak to A. So really, as you're going through this game and you're catching more monsters, your team should always contain monsters to cover the rock, paper, scissors spectrum. And the nice thing is, like Pokemon, they give you 6 monsters you can carry at any one time, and you can go swap out your new monsters for ones in your computer if you want later, but you've got a nice wide variety of monsters that should be able to handle any sort of situation. And the fact that you have to fight them to catch them, like any other monster catching RPG, means you're gonna understand where the monster you're fighting and ultimately adding to your team sits on that weakness and strength spectrum. As you level, you'll gain new abilities for each monster, which you kind of expect from these games, but what I've found found to be really odd about these games is I never really found myself needing to level up my monsters necessarily, you know? Part of the reason is, in terms of combat with other Sanriomon trainers, this game actually takes a page from my beloved Metarod franchise, and that is when you beat another Sanriomon trainer, which happens to be represented by one of Hello Kitty's many friends, you then get to go through their inventory and steal one monster of your choice. And by the time you get there, their monster is probably going to be on par with yours, or maybe even a little better. So while you could sit here and train up new monsters till the cows come home, you could just as easily, you know, add one monster to your roster from your opponents and replace one of your weaker ones. And I found that to be a really effective strategy because ultimately that cut down on grinding. I didn't have to sit in one area and level up 3 to 6 monsters at any one time when I could just go fight a guy and get a monster that was already stronger than anything I had. It was really sort of a nice, refreshing take on the system. Another nice thing about leveling up your Sanriomons is the fact that if a monster gets switched into combat, they get a share of the experience. Now, this is pretty standard for really any RPG, but what you expect is they get a fraction of the experience, when in actuality it seems like they just get the full amount of experience that was given by defeating the previous monster. Every individual participant in combat gets that. So you could, if you wanted to power level your team, just swap through your entire roster while fighting one monster, defeat it, everyone gets experience, move on to the next one. It felt like a weird system, but it did definitely cut down on time spent leveling, for what very little of it there actually was in this game. Because everything you do in this game seems to push you forward and advance you further without requiring you to stick around for any period of time. Now that said, if you want to capture every Sanriomon in the area, there's usually 5 or 6 per area. You might have to sit around for a little bit, but it's still not too bad. There's never really a need for grinding. All you'd really end up needing is to go to the store to pick up some more camera film to capture more monsters for your team, or to go to the nurse to talk to Hello Kitty to heal your entire team. But other than that, there's not really a need to hang out in one particular area for any extended period of time. And that's really refreshing for an RPG. It's very fast-paced, and like training monsters, everything you do seems to push you forward instead of forcing you to hang around and force you to wallow in your own lack of progress, because everything you do progresses you in this game. And I think that's the overall core mantra of this game, is everything works to progress you forward. And for an RPG to do that is really kind of impressive to me. All the mechanics seem to work really well, combat works great, there's weaknesses and strengths, but they're very easy to pick up on. So in its own respect, while it is very clearly trying to hop on the bandwagon of much better monster raising and training simulators, it has its own advantages and advancements over top of them, too. And I think it's important to be recognized. The overall presentation to Sanrio Timenet Mirai is excellent. Visually, I don't know if the monsters are supposed to look just really goofy, or like the people who designed it just were incredibly lazy and being dumb, but something about these monsters are just silly and goofy, and I love it. There's a monster that's just a power cord, and there's one that's a Zen monk, and there's one that's a guy that has a giant yam for a face. What's not to love about these monsters? They are insane and goofy, and yeah, they're not necessarily all that cool or all that fantastic, but I think their overall goofiness lends itself to being a very charming game. The environments themselves are relatively simplistic, but you know, there's enough of a variance to them that they work for what they need to do, and it's not dull. And the audio presentation to this game is really just sort of average. Honestly, I don't remember any of the music, but I don't remember any of it being terribly offensive or anything. It sort of worked, but wasn't that great. But the presentation itself, if nothing else, just for those amazing sprites, is totally worth it in my opinion. If you want a copy of Sanrio Timenet, cheapest one I'm seeing, which is both individual versions, is $1.30. And I think these games are absolutely worth it. Maybe don't necessarily buy both like I did, but they are functionally basically the same game. One, you spend some time in the past, one, you spend some time in the future, and the monsters they have are slightly different, but you can complete the game with just having one version. That said, they are ridiculously cheap, so you can get both for basically nothing, and there is basically no barrier to entry in terms of language, just because the way the game naturally funnels you through its environments allows you to really understand what you're doing without really ever getting stuck. And the combat itself is so incredibly straightforward, a child could understand it without having any sort of problems. Basically, while this game sort of exists to be a knockoff, with some weird Sanrio branding in it, it is in and of itself a really solid monster catching RPG. I wish there was a translation of it, but it's simple enough to get into. I guess the game sold well enough because it did get a sequel once again, in a pair of monster training RPGs that were basically the same thing in two different versions, known as the SpaceNet games, which I also have one of. Although weirdly enough, that version did not have the Sanrio branding, so I'm guessing Sanrio wasn't as impressed with how well they sold. That said, these games are simple, they're fun to pick up, they are goofy, and they are just a solid RPG time. And even if you don't understand the language, it's not a huge, insurmountable task to get around. In the end, while Sanrio Timenet exists to be a knockoff, it is in its own right, its own unique thing that is, in its own way, superior to the competition in a few ways. Not many, mind you, but in a few ways, I'd say it's even better than some of the Pokemon from the time. There were so many games that were trying to be Pokemon. You had the Metarot games, which were, again, in their own right, a pretty good thing. You had the Telefang games, which were decent. You had the Bug Sight games. There was some weird Taito branded one I got recently. I have to look that one up again. But the point is, there's so many, and I think this one stands out as being a fun, goofy time that, had it had the power of time travel and had gone back to before Pokemon ever existed, we might be saying, man, that Pokemon thing isn't quite as good as this. I mean, I can't think of any other monster racing RPGs where the Sanriomon Center is run by Nurse Hello Kitty, and that alone makes this game worth like the $1 it costs.